Training our emotions starts with a powerful, sometimes challenging step: recognizing and accepting them. This means acknowledging our feelings, not with judgment, but with curiosity. So often we try to control or suppress what we feel, as if our emotions are inconvenient or unwelcome. We label certain emotions as good or bad, weak or strong, but the truth is, emotions are just information. They're signals, messengers from our inner lives, and every single one of them matters. Recognizing our emotions is like opening the door to ourselves and saying, "Yes, I see you and I'm listening." When we give ourselves permission to feel, we're saying, "It's okay to feel this way right now. This doesn't mean we have to act on every feeling or that every emotion needs to define us. It simply means that we're brave enough to notice what's there." Maybe it's sadness, maybe it's frustration, or maybe it's joy that feels too good to trust. When we can name these feelings without pushing them away, we give ourselves a moment to understand why they're there. It's almost like sitting down with a friend and asking, "What's on your mind?" Accepting our emotions is a practice that asks us to go beyond labels and see each feeling as valid. We might struggle with anger, for example, because society has taught us it's an unacceptable emotion. But anger has a place it might be showing us where we need to set boundaries or pointing to something deeply important to us. Similarly, anxiety might be a sign that something within us needs our attention. So instead of trying to get rid of emotions, we start training ourselves to ask what they're here to teach us. When we recognize and accept what we feel, we also bring compassion into the mix. Imagine talking to a close friend about something painful in their life. You wouldn't belittle their feelings, you'd listen, validate, and support them. But how often do we extend that same compassion to ourselves? When we take the time to recognize our emotions in this way, we're telling ourselves, "I'm worthy of understanding and compassion, even if I'm struggling." Accepting emotions doesn't mean we let them control us. In fact, the opposite is true. When we practice this kind of acceptance, we're no longer afraid of what we feel. We can move through emotions without becoming stuck in them, knowing that every feeling, like a wave, will rise and fall. There's freedom in knowing that even our most intense emotions are temporary. This acceptance isn't about letting go of emotions entirely, but about loosening the grip so that emotions don't define our behavior. When we start to recognize and accept our emotions without resistance, we also learn that every feeling holds a purpose. It's not always a comfortable process, but it's incredibly freeing. It gives us a foundation from which to manage and understand our emotional lives, not by shutting parts of ourselves down, but by embracing them with honesty and courage. This is how we begin to transform our emotional lives, by building an inner world where all parts of us have a voice. Identifying our triggers is an essential part of emotional training, one that takes self-awareness, curiosity, and a willingness to go deeper than surface reactions. Triggers are the situations, words, or people that seem to pull an emotional response out of us before we even realize it's happening. These reactions can feel automatic, intense, and sometimes overwhelming, leaving us wondering, why did I respond like that? Understanding our triggers helps us unravel the mystery of these reactions and ultimately allows us to regain control over our responses. When we begin to recognize our triggers, we're diving into a process of discovering what lies beneath them. Triggers often stem from past experiences, unresolved pain, or vulnerabilities that haven't been fully processed. They're like hidden landmines connected to moments in our lives when we felt threatened, hurt, or devalued. If someone dismisses our opinion, for example, and we feel a rush of defensiveness, it could be because at some point we were made to feel small or unheard. Or if we find ourselves reacting to criticism with anger, it might reflect a time when criticism was tied to shame or rejection. These connections are not always obvious. They take time and self-reflection to reveal. Once we start to identify our triggers, we create a new kind of emotional awareness. We learn to recognize patterns, who we're with, where we are, or what's happening around us when certain emotions flare up. For example, we might notice that we feel anxious before a big meeting or frustrated when someone questions our abilities. The more we notice these patterns, the better we become at spotting the circumstances that make us vulnerable to emotional reactions. Understanding our triggers gives us a choice. Instead of reacting impulsively, we can pause, breathe, and decide how we want to respond. Knowing our triggers is like having a map of the landscape of our emotional life. We know where the rough patches are, where the cliffs drop off, and where the safe zones lie. This awareness doesn't mean we'll avoid every trigger, but it does mean we can approach situations with more insight and preparedness. Exploring our triggers is also an opportunity for healing. When we recognize that certain situations provoke a reaction tied to an unresolved wound, we have the chance to confront and understand it. Maybe it's a fear of abandonment, a need for approval, or a deep-seated feeling of inadequacy. By acknowledging these connections, we can start the work of addressing the original source of pain, instead of letting it resurface in present-day interactions. Identifying triggers requires self-compassion. This process isn't about blaming ourselves for past experiences or judging our reactions, it's about understanding them. We need to be gentle with ourselves, knowing that everyone has triggers rooted in something meaningful, something that shaped them. Being kind as we uncover these layers allows us to approach our emotional responses with empathy, making it easier to address and transform them. When we know our triggers, we gain the freedom to choose how we'll respond in moments that once felt uncontrollable. Instead of feeling like we're caught off guard or emotionally hijacked, we can take a breath and decide, is this how I want to react? Is there another way to handle this? This level of awareness doesn't make us immune to emotional reactions, but it does help us engage with them more consciously. Identifying triggers takes time and reflection, but the payoff is profound. It's a way of reclaiming control over our emotional lives, turning reactions into responses and impulsive moments into thoughtful decisions. By uncovering our triggers, we empower ourselves to act with intention and self-awareness, creating healthier, more authentic relationships with ourselves and others. Practicing vulnerability is one of the most courageous steps we can take in training our emotions. Vulnerability is often misunderstood as weakness, as if sharing our true thoughts, fears, and insecurities is somehow a flaw. But real vulnerability is anything but weak. It's the willingness to show up and be seen as we truly are, to risk rejection or misunderstanding, because we know that living authentically is worth it. Vulnerability is the birthplace of connection, empathy, and emotional resilience. When we open up, we invite others into our world and allow ourselves to feel supported, seen, and understood. Practicing vulnerability means being honest about what we feel, even when it's uncomfortable. This could mean admitting when we're hurt, sharing our dreams, or expressing a fear we'd rather hide. These moments require bravery as they expose us in a way that makes us feel open and unguarded. But in that very exposure, we find freedom. We give ourselves permission to feel without apology, and in doing so, we begin to let go of the armor we've built around ourselves. This armor might make us feel safe, but it also distances us from genuine connection and healing. Vulnerability is a powerful way to strengthen emotional awareness because it forces us to face the truths we often ignore or avoid. When we avoid being vulnerable, we also avoid the deeper work of examining what's beneath the surface of our reactions and feelings. For example, sharing with a friend that we're feeling overwhelmed or inadequate can be difficult, but it also brings us to the root of what's really going on. It stops us from burying our feelings, allowing us to process them instead of letting them fester beneath the surface. When we're vulnerable, we also open the door for others to be vulnerable with us. This creates a cycle of trust, connection, and empathy. We show others that they're not alone in their struggles, that they too can open up without judgment. Vulnerability is contagious, and the best way it gives people permission to drop their masks, to be honest about their own struggles, and to create a sense of community where everyone feels supported. In this shared space, we begin to see that the things we fear exposing are often the very things others can relate to, the universal parts of being human that everyone experiences in one way or another. Being vulnerable also helps us dismantle perfectionism. When we practice vulnerability, we recognize that we don't have to be flawless or always put together. It's okay to let others see our imperfections, our struggles, and our missteps. In fact, it's often our imperfections that make us relatable, approachable, and human. Vulnerability teaches us that real strength doesn't come from projecting an image of perfection, it comes from being true to who we are, messiness and all. But practicing vulnerability doesn't mean sharing everything with everyone. It's about finding safe, trusted spaces and relationships where we feel supported and heard. Vulnerability requires boundaries. It's choosing to share with those who have earned our trust, who respect our journey, and who are open to reciprocal connection. This careful sharing allows us to feel secure in our openness, knowing that our vulnerability will be met with understanding rather than judgment or dismissal. Practicing vulnerability also builds resilience. Every time we open up and survive the experience, every time we face the fear of being judged or rejected and realize that we're still okay, we build inner strength. We start to trust that we can handle whatever comes our way. We learn that we don't need to hide or pretend to be someone we're not in order to be worthy of acceptance. Vulnerability is a process that strengthens our self-acceptance, creating a solid foundation for emotional health and well-being. In the end, practicing vulnerability isn't about seeking approval or validation from others. It's about showing up authentically and letting go of the need to be seen as invulnerable. It's about honoring our own experiences, accepting our own emotions, and allowing ourselves to be fully human in a world that often tells us to be anything but. Through vulnerability, we train our emotions by learning to embrace them, share them, and trust in our ability to be our true selves. This courage to be vulnerable becomes one of our greatest sources of strength, transforming the way we relate to ourselves and to others. Developing empathy toward yourself and others is one of the most profound practices in emotional training. At its core, empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another, to connect with their experience without judgment or the need to fix anything. But before we can truly empathize with others, we must first cultivate that same compassion for ourselves. Often we are our harshest critics, condemning ourselves for our mistakes, flaws, and perceived shortcomings. Yet empathy begins within. It's a practice of recognizing that we are worthy of kindness and understanding, just as we would offer that kindness to a dear friend. When we develop empathy for ourselves, we start by acknowledging our struggles and emotions with openness rather than denying or suppressing them. We stop demanding perfection and instead give ourselves permission to be human. This means giving ourselves grace when we make mistakes, being patient when we feel overwhelmed, and comforting ourselves when we face disappointment. It's in those moments of self-compassion that we begin to realize we don't need to be flawless to be worthy of love and acceptance. Embracing this truth allows us to lower the walls we've built around our hearts, making it easier to connect with our own emotional world and in turn with others. Self-empathy also involves being aware of the negative self-talk that can creep into our minds, particularly during moments of vulnerability or failure. How often do we berate ourselves for feeling weak or too sensitive or not good enough? These judgments can create a cycle of shame that keeps us from growing. Developing self-empathy means recognizing when we're being unkind to ourselves and replacing that narrative with one of compassion. Instead of seeing ourselves as inadequate for feeling sad, angry, or fearful, we begin to see those emotions as part of the human experience, valid, important, and worthy of attention. Once we begin to nurture this internal empathy, we are better equipped to extend it to others. Empathy for others is not just about understanding what they're going through, it's about connecting with their humanity. It's about showing up for someone not with solutions, but with presence. It's about listening deeply without rushing to fix their problems or offer advice. Often what people need most when they're suffering is not a quick fix, but someone who truly sees them, hears them, and feels with them. By cultivating empathy, we become more attuned to the emotional landscapes of those around us, understanding that their pain, joy, or confusion is just as valid as our own. Empathy toward others also means recognizing that every person has their own story, their own unique set of experiences that shape how they think, feel, and behave. It's easy to judge others based on our own perspective, but empathy requires us to step outside of our own shoes and into theirs. It's about acknowledging that their struggles are real, even if they don't look like our own, and offering them the same understanding and compassion we would hope for ourselves. This doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior or enabling toxic dynamics, but rather it means seeing the person behind the actions and acknowledging their pain or their journey. When we practice empathy toward others, we also open ourselves up to deeper, more meaningful connections. Empathy fosters vulnerability because it invites us to feel with others, to experience their emotions as if they were our own. This emotional resonance can create a bond that transcends surface-level interactions, allowing us to build relationships rooted in mutual respect and understanding. When we approach others with empathy, we create a safe space for them to share their truth, knowing they won't be judged or dismissed. Empathy is a bridge between isolation and connection. It allows us to see that we are not alone in our struggles. As we extend empathy to others, we recognize that the things we experience, our pain, our triumphs, our growth, are universal. This realization fosters a sense of community and shared humanity. When we develop empathy, we stop viewing others as separate from ourselves and start seeing them as partners in this journey called life. Ultimately, the practice of developing empathy is about recognizing the value in both ourselves and others. It's about treating our emotions with care and tenderness, acknowledging our flaws and imperfections, and offering the same level of respect to the people we encounter. Through empathy, we build emotional resilience because we learn to navigate the complexities of our own emotional lives while staying open and connected to the emotions of others. This dual compassion toward ourselves and toward others helps us foster a deeper sense of emotional intelligence, creating stronger, more supportive relationships that nourish our well-being and enrich our capacity for growth. Setting boundaries is one of the most empowering and essential practices in emotional training. Boundaries are not about building walls to shut people out. They are about creating healthy limits that protect our emotional well-being, allowing us to engage with the world and others from a place of clarity and self-respect. Many of us have been taught to prioritize others' needs over our own, to please, to accommodate, and to sacrifice our own emotional health for the sake of harmony or approval. But the truth is, without boundaries, we become depleted, disconnected, and ultimately lose sight of our own needs. Setting boundaries is not selfish, it's a vital act of self-care that affirms our worth and our right to protect our time, energy, and emotional space. Boundaries are about knowing where we end and where others begin. They are the invisible lines we draw to establish what is acceptable and what is not in our relationships and interactions. These lines help us define our limits, communicate our needs, and create space for self-preservation without feeling guilty or ashamed. Setting boundaries allows us to say, this is where I stand without needing to justify or apologize for our choices. They are an expression of self-respect and a way of saying, I matter and my feelings and needs matter. Setting boundaries requires self-awareness and clarity. We need to understand what we need and what we can tolerate in our emotional, physical, and mental spaces. This takes time, reflection, and honest self-inquiry. For example, when do you feel drained, anxious, or frustrated by a particular person or situation? What are the patterns that leave you feeling emotionally unfulfilled or overwhelmed? These are the cues that guide us toward identifying where we need to set boundaries. Without this awareness, we can easily fall into unhealthy dynamics, where we're constantly giving, accommodating, or compromising in ways that don't honor our own needs. Once we understand where we need boundaries, the next step is to communicate them clearly and respectfully. This can be one of the most challenging aspects of boundary setting, especially for those who fear conflict or rejection. However, boundaries are not about being rigid or controlling, they're about protecting our emotional health so that we can show up as our best selves. Communicating our boundaries is not about demanding others change, but rather about asserting our needs in a way that fosters mutual respect. For instance, if you're feeling overwhelmed by work, saying, I need to take a break and disconnect from my responsibilities for a bit is an honest and straightforward boundary that protects your time and energy. It's important to remember that setting boundaries is an ongoing practice, not a one-time event. People may not always respect your boundaries, and you may encounter resistance or discomfort when you first begin asserting them. This is where consistency becomes key. When others test your boundaries, it's crucial to reinforce them firmly but kindly without compromising or giving in. Each time you do this, you're training both yourself and others to respect your limits. It's also important to recognize that boundaries can evolve as we grow and change. What may have been an acceptable boundary in one phase of life may no longer serve us in the next. It's okay to reassess and adjust your boundaries as your needs shift. Setting boundaries also means accepting that we can't always please everyone. It means understanding that by saying no to one thing, we are saying yes to ourselves. This is a profound shift in perspective. We often feel guilty when we set limits with others, especially if they react negatively or feel rejected. But when we set boundaries, we are honoring our own emotional needs, and we are teaching others how to treat us with respect. This is an act of self-love, not selfishness. We cannot give from an empty cup. If we do not establish boundaries, we risk burnout, resentment, and emotional exhaustion. Boundaries are essential in all kinds of relationships, whether with family, friends, colleagues, or even with ourselves. In relationships with others, boundaries help us protect our emotional space and maintain a sense of autonomy. In our relationship with ourselves, boundaries allow us to honor our own needs for rest, growth, and peace. It might mean saying no to commitments that drain us, setting limits on how much emotional labor we take on, or carving out time for ourselves in the midst of busy schedules. It's about recognizing that we are deserving of space, respect, and care. In setting boundaries, we also create an opportunity for growth and healing. When we honor our limits, we open the door for more authentic connections with others. We invite people into our lives who respect our boundaries and who are willing to meet us in healthy, balanced relationships. We stop pretending to be someone we're not or sacrificing our own well-being to avoid conflict. Instead, we show up as our true selves, knowing that we are worthy of love, respect, and care just as we are. In this process, we strengthen our emotional resilience and create a foundation of self-respect that allows us to thrive, not just survive in our relationships and in our own lives. Pausing before reacting is one of the most powerful practices in emotional training. In the heat of the moment, our immediate reactions often come from a place of instinct shaped by years of conditioning, past experiences, and deep-seated emotions. These reflexive responses may feel justified or even necessary, but they can also be driven by fear, anger, or hurt, causing us to say or do things that we might regret later. Pausing before reacting is not about suppressing emotions or pretending they don't exist. It's about creating the space to respond thoughtfully, with intention rather than reacting impulsively. When we pause before reacting, we allow ourselves a moment of emotional awareness. This pause gives us the opportunity to notice what we are feeling, to identify the underlying emotions that might be driving our immediate reaction. Often, our initial response is not about the situation at hand, but about something deeper, an unresolved fear, an old wound, or a past experience that's being triggered. The pause allows us to recognize these emotions for what they are, separate from the situation, so we don't let them dictate our actions. For example, if someone raises their voice at us, we might immediately feel defensive or angry. But if we take a moment to pause, we may recognize that the anger isn't just about that person's behavior. It might be a trigger from a past experience where we felt unheard or disrespected. Recognizing this gives us the opportunity to choose how to respond, instead of reacting from a place of past pain. This pause creates a gap between stimulus and response, a space where we can exercise control over our emotions. In that space, we can decide how we want to respond, not based on our immediate emotional reaction, but from a place of clarity and purpose. This practice doesn't mean we suppress or ignore our emotions. It means we acknowledge them, feel them, and then choose how to move forward. In this moment, we can ask ourselves important questions. What am I really feeling? Why am I feeling this way? What do I need in this moment? What would be the healthiest response for me and for the situation? The pause is also a practice of emotional regulation. When we react without pause, our emotions can take over, and our behavior can spiral out of control. We might lash out in anger, withdraw in hurt, or say things we don't mean. But when we pause, we regulate our emotions by allowing them to rise, be felt, and then dissipate before we act on them. This emotional regulation is a skill that helps us remain grounded and centered, even in challenging or triggering situations. By practicing the pause, we train ourselves to respond from a place of emotional intelligence rather than from the grip of our emotions. The pause also gives us the opportunity to observe the situation objectively. When we react without thinking, we often see only our own perspective, filtered through our emotional lens. But when we take a moment to pause, we allow ourselves to step back and gain a broader view. This moment of reflection can help us better understand the other person's perspective, motivations, and needs. Maybe their behavior isn't about us at all, but about their own struggles or frustrations. In this space, we can choose to respond with empathy and understanding rather than defensiveness or aggression. Another powerful aspect of pausing before reacting is that it helps us take responsibility for our emotions and actions. Too often, we give our power away by blaming others for how we feel. We say things like, "You made me angry," or "You hurt me," as if we have no control over our emotional state. But when we pause, we recognize that our emotions are ours to manage and our responses are choices. We don't have to give in to every emotional impulse. We have the power to decide how to engage with our emotions and ultimately how to engage with the world around us. This shift in perspective helps us reclaim our emotional sovereignty and empowers us to act in ways that align with our values, not our immediate feelings. The pause is also a practice of self-compassion. In moments of emotional intensity, it's easy to beat ourselves up for losing our cool or acting in ways that don't reflect our best selves. But pausing allows us to respond to ourselves with patience and kindness. We recognize that we are human, that we will make mistakes, and that we don't need to be perfect. The pause allows us to gather ourselves before reacting, to give ourselves the space to act with integrity, even in moments of emotional distress. Finally, the pause fosters healthier relationships. When we take a moment before reacting, we model emotional intelligence for others. We create a space where we can engage in difficult conversations without escalating conflict, where we can listen more deeply and communicate more effectively. Pausing before reacting helps us avoid making assumptions or judgments, allowing us to respond with more clarity and care. It also encourages others to take a step back and reflect before responding, creating a more thoughtful, compassionate dynamic in our interactions. In the end, pausing before reacting is an act of emotional mastery. It's a way of recognizing that our emotions, while powerful, do not need to control us. It's a practice of self-awareness, self-regulation, and emotional intelligence that helps us respond to life's challenges with grace, clarity, and intention. Every pause is an opportunity to choose our response, to honor our feelings without being ruled by them, and to engage with the world in a way that reflects our true values and emotional wisdom. Reframing negative self-talk is a transformative practice that plays a critical role in emotional training. Often, the most significant barrier to emotional health and resilience lies in the way we speak to ourselves. Our inner dialogue, the voice inside our heads, is powerful. It shapes how we view ourselves, our worth, and our place in the world. When this voice is dominated by criticism, doubt, and harsh judgment, it undermines our emotional well-being and creates a cycle of self-sabotage. Reframing negative self-talk is not just about changing words, it's about shifting the lens through which we view ourselves and our experiences. It's about learning to see ourselves with kindness, understanding, and compassion, rather than through the filter of fear or shame. The first step in reframing negative self-talk is recognizing it. We often aren't even aware of the critical thoughts that run through our minds on a daily basis. These thoughts can be so ingrained that they feel like truths. "I'm not good enough, I'll never succeed," or "I always mess up" are just a few examples of the ways we may speak to ourselves. These thoughts can feel automatic, almost like they're part of who we are. But the truth is, they are learned patterns, often from past experiences, societal expectations, or even the messages we received growing up. To reframe them, we must first develop the awareness to notice when they arise, which means becoming more attuned to our internal dialogue. Once we begin to notice these negative thoughts, the next step is to challenge them. Negative self-talk often feeds on distorted beliefs about ourselves, beliefs that aren't based on objective reality, but on assumptions, fears, or past failures. For example, if we make a mistake, the negative self-talk might say, I'm a failure, when in reality, everyone makes mistakes. Mistakes are part of learning and growth, not an indication of inherent inadequacy. By questioning these thoughts, we can begin to dismantle their power. We can ask ourselves, is this thought really true? What evidence do I have to support it? Am I being overly harsh with myself? Reframing negative self-talk also involves replacing harmful thoughts with more constructive, compassionate alternatives. This isn't about simply thinking positive or ignoring the reality of challenges. It's about acknowledging the difficulty of the situation while still offering ourselves support and encouragement. Instead of saying, I'm not good enough, we can reframe it to, I'm doing the best I can and I am capable of learning and improving. Instead of thinking, I'll never succeed, we can replace it with, success is a journey and setbacks are part of that process. I'm not defined by one moment. These reframed thoughts don't deny the existence of obstacles or imperfections, but they place us in a mindset that recognizes our worth, resilience, and ability to grow. A key part of reframing negative self-talk is cultivating self-compassion. Self-compassion means treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding we would offer a close friend. When we make a mistake or face a challenge, we don't berate ourselves. Instead, we offer words of comfort and encouragement. We recognize that we are human, that we are not perfect, and that it's okay to struggle. By practicing self-compassion, we start to shift the inner dialogue from one of criticism to one of empathy. We begin to see ourselves not as failures, but as people who are worthy of love and care, even in the face of flaws or setbacks. Reframing negative self-talk also requires us to challenge the fear of judgment and rejection that often underlies our inner criticism. So many of our negative thoughts stem from a deep-seated fear of not being enough or of being judged by others. These fears can drive us to be excessively critical of ourselves, constantly striving for perfection or avoiding failure at all costs. But when we reframe our thinking, we start to let go of the need for external validation and approval. We recognize that our worth is not dependent on how others see us, but on how we see ourselves. This shift in perspective allows us to become more compassionate and less judgmental toward ourselves. Reframing negative self-talk also involves embracing the concept of growth mindset, the belief that our abilities and intelligence are not fixed, but can be developed over time. When we view challenges as opportunities for growth, rather than as reflections of our limitations, we can approach setbacks with curiosity and resilience rather than with shame or defeat. Instead of thinking, I'm just not good at this, we can think, this is difficult. But I'm learning and improving with each step. This shift in mindset helps us approach our experiences with more openness, understanding that every effort, no matter the outcome, is part of our development. Another important aspect of reframing negative self-talk is practicing gratitude for ourselves. When we focus on what we are doing right, rather than on what we perceive as wrong, we begin to appreciate our efforts, strengths, and progress. It's easy to get caught in a cycle of self-criticism, especially when we compare ourselves to others or when we face setbacks. But by intentionally shifting our focus to the positive aspects of ourselves, we begin to build a more balanced, realistic view. Gratitude helps us see the full picture of who we are, the strengths, the weaknesses, the progress, and the setbacks, all as part of the beautiful, imperfect journey of being human. Reframing negative self-talk is also about creating a new relationship with failure. Instead of seeing failure as an indictment of who we are, we begin to see it as a natural part of the process. Everyone experiences setbacks. No one is immune to making mistakes or facing challenges. Failure does not define us, it refines us. When we reframe our thinking around failure, we start to approach it not with fear, but with curiosity and a willingness to learn. I failed becomes I learned, and in that reframing, we unlock the potential for growth and resilience. Finally, reframing negative self-talk is an ongoing practice. It is not something we achieve once and then forget. It requires constant attention, awareness, and effort. Our inner critic will always be there, but with time and practice, we can learn to quiet it, or at least challenge its power. Each time we catch ourselves in a negative thought pattern, we have the opportunity to reframe, to shift our perspective, and to offer ourselves kindness instead of judgment. By making this practice a habit, we gradually build a stronger, more compassionate inner voice that reflects our true worth and potential. Reframing negative self-talk is ultimately about transforming the way we view ourselves from critical, harsh, and unforgiving to supportive, understanding, and loving. This shift is one of the most powerful ways we can train our emotions, creating a foundation of self-acceptance and emotional resilience that empowers us to navigate life with confidence and grace. Committing to self-care practices is an essential aspect of emotional well-being, yet it's often the first thing we neglect when life becomes overwhelming. In a world that constantly demands more of us, more work, more responsibility, more attention, taking time for ourselves can feel like a luxury or even a selfish indulgence. But in reality, self-care is not a luxury, it's a necessity. It's the foundation upon which our emotional, mental, and physical health is built. Committing to self-care is a radical act of self-love that acknowledges that we deserve to be cared for, nurtured, and prioritized just as much as anyone else in our lives. At its core, self-care is about recognizing and honoring our needs, our need for rest, for rejuvenation, for peace, and for joy. It's about listening to our bodies and minds, noticing when we're running on empty, and choosing to refill our cup before it runs dry. Self-care doesn't just refer to the occasional bubble bath or day off. It's a holistic practice that encompasses the small, everyday choices we make to preserve our well-being. It's about showing up for ourselves in ways that support our growth, healing, and happiness. Committing to self-care requires a shift in mindset. For many of us, especially those who have spent years putting others first or working ourselves into burnout, the idea of taking time for ourselves can feel uncomfortable or even guilt-inducing. We may feel that we don't have the time or that we're being selfish, but in truth, we cannot pour from an empty cup. When we neglect our own needs, we not only deprive ourselves of the energy and clarity we need to thrive, but we also risk becoming less available, less present, and less compassionate toward others. Self-care is not an act of selfishness, it's an act of self-preservation. By committing to self-care, we ensure that we have the strength and vitality to show up for others and for the demands of life from a place of balance, not depletion. Committing to self-care also means learning to prioritize our well-being over external expectations. So often, we place the needs and demands of others, whether it's at work, in relationships, or within our communities above our own. We say yes to others at the expense of our own health, believing that we must be constantly available or productive to be valued. But in order to care for others in a meaningful way, we must first care for ourselves. This requires the courage to say no when necessary, to establish healthy boundaries, and to recognize that our worth is not determined by how much we do for others. Self-care means giving ourselves permission to pause, rest, and tend to our needs without guilt or hesitation. The commitment to self-care also requires the discipline to make it a consistent practice. It's easy to get caught up in the busyness of life and neglect our well-being for the sake of productivity or responsibility. But true self-care is about making space for ourselves every day, not just when we're on the brink of burnout. It means carving out time for activities that nourish us, whether it's engaging in a creative hobby, going for a walk in nature, spending time with loved ones, or simply resting. It's about recognizing that we deserve to show up for ourselves daily in small, meaningful ways. These daily acts of self-care accumulate over time, providing us with the resilience, clarity, and emotional strength we need to navigate life's challenges. Physical self-care is often the first thing that comes to mind when we think about self-care, and it is undeniably important. Our bodies are the vessels that carry us through life, and we must care for them with respect and mindfulness. This includes getting enough sleep, eating nourishing foods, moving our bodies, and seeking medical care when necessary. But self-care extends beyond the physical realm. It encompasses our mental and emotional health as well. Mental self-care involves engaging in practices that support our cognitive well-being, such as mindfulness, meditation, journaling, or therapy. Emotional self-care means acknowledging our feelings, processing them, and allowing ourselves to experience the full range of human emotions without judgment. It's about allowing ourselves the space to feel, grieve, celebrate, and heal. All of these forms of self-care are interconnected. When we care for one aspect of ourselves, we naturally improve the others. Part of committing to self-care is recognizing that it's not about perfection, it's about progress. We are human, and we will have days when we fall short of our own expectations. There will be days when we feel tired, stressed, or overwhelmed. And that's okay. Self-care isn't about being perfect, it's about showing up for ourselves with compassion, no matter how messy or imperfect life feels. It's about forgiving ourselves when we slip up and getting back on track without shame or self-criticism. It's understanding that self-care is a lifelong journey, not a destination. We don't need to get it perfect every time, we just need to keep trying and be kind to ourselves along the way. Self-care also requires us to cultivate joy and connection in our lives. It's easy to get caught in the cycle of work, responsibilities, and obligations, but true self-care includes making time for the things that light us up, that bring us joy, and that connect us with others. Whether it's engaging in a hobby, spending quality time with loved ones, or simply enjoying the beauty of the world around us, these moments of joy recharge our spirits and remind us of what we're living for. Committing to self-care means intentionally creating moments of happiness and connection, even in the midst of our busy lives. Another aspect of committing to self-care is learning to listen to our intuition. Often we know what we need, but we are too busy or distracted to hear the quiet whisper of our own inner voice. We must commit to slowing down and tuning into ourselves, to trust our instincts and our inner wisdom. This requires creating space for stillness, for reflection, and for introspection. When we listen to our intuition, we can make decisions that are aligned with our true needs and desires, rather than with external pressures or expectations. Ultimately, committing to self-care is about cultivating a loving, compassionate relationship with ourselves. It's about treating ourselves with the same kindness, patience, and respect that we would extend to a dear friend or loved one. It's recognizing that we are worthy of care, of love, and of attention, not because of what we do or achieve, but because of who we are. When we commit to self-care, we acknowledge that we are not machines to be constantly productive, but human beings deserving of rest, joy, and connection. By choosing to prioritize ourselves, we become more present, more compassionate, and more capable of meeting life's challenges with resilience and grace. Committing to self-care is a crucial practice for emotional, mental, and physical well-being. It requires recognizing our needs and honoring them by prioritizing rest, nourishment, and connection. Self-care is not selfish, it's an act of self-preservation, ensuring we have the energy and strength to show up for others in life's challenges. It involves making time for practices that nurture our body, mind, and emotions, while also setting boundaries and saying no when necessary. Self-care is a continuous process, not about perfection but progress, showing up for ourselves with compassion, embracing joy, and listening to our intuition. Ultimately, it's about building a loving relationship with ourselves, treating ourselves with kindness and respect, and acknowledging that we are worthy of care simply because we are.